Be me. Censure E. Communications manager. Married for 6 years. To husband Michael, who was 33 and worked as project manager at construction company, had strong feminist beliefs about conversational equity, posted frequently about how men dominated conversations, and talked over women constantly. Believed women's voices were silenced in relationships by men who monopolized discussion time and made everything about themselves. Michael was a naturally talkative person who loved sharing stories about his day, projects at work, and things he learned or observed. Would come home from construction sites, excited to tell me about challenges they'd solved or interesting techniques they'd used. Meanwhile, I'd often have quieter days working in communications. Less dramatic stories to share about email campaigns and reports. Started feeling like our dinner conversations were unbalanced. With Michael talking more than me about his workday experiences, posted on feminist forums about husband who dominated dinner conversations with his work stories while not asking enough about mine. Got responses from other women who related to husbands who made conversations one-sided by talking excessively about themselves. One woman suggested tracking conversation time to prove men really do talk more than they realize in relationships. Started mentally timing how long Michael talked versus how long I talked during our evening conversations together. Estimated he talked maybe 60 to 70% of conversation time, while I talked 30 to 40% based on my observations and tracking. This confirmed my belief that he was dominating conversations even if he didn't realize he was centering himself constantly. Had conversation with Michael about needing more balanced discussion time where I had equal space to share my experiences. He seemed surprised and said he thought our conversations were natural back and forth. Asked what I wanted different, I said I needed him to talk less and ask me more questions rather than filling all the space with his own stories. He said okay. He'd try to be more conscious about conversation balance and making sure I had time to share. Following week, Michael seemed to be trying to talk less. Would catch himself mid-story and ask about my day instead. But his asking felt forced and awkward rather than natural curiosity about my work and experiences. When I'd share about my communications work, he'd listen and nod, but didn't engage with follow-up questions like before. Conversations felt stilted and uncomfortable rather than the easy flow we'd had when he was talking more naturally. Posted in feminist groups about how husband was trying to talk less, but it felt performative, not genuine interest. One woman said he needs to not just talk less but actually be curious about your work and ask meaningful questions. Another said men often do bare minimum when asked to change. Need to push for genuine engagement. Not just less talking. Had another conversation with Michael, saying I appreciated him talking less, but needed him to ask more substantive questions. That I didn't just want quiet space. I wanted him to be genuinely interested and engaged with my work and day. He looked frustrated and said he was trying to do what I'd asked by talking less and giving me more space. I said talking less without genuine curiosity wasn't the point. Point was him being interested in my experiences equally. He said quietly that he'd try to ask better questions and be more engaged when I was sharing about my work. Second week, he was asking more questions, but they felt like interview questions, checking boxes rather than real interest. Would ask, how was your day? Then what projects are you working on? Then how did that meeting go? In sequence, answered his questions, but it felt mechanical, like he was going through a list of required questions. Not natural conversation. When I'd finish answering, he'd sit quietly rather than naturally transitioning to his own updates or sharing anything. Dinners became awkward periods where he'd ask his questions. I'd answer. Then we'd sit in silence until conversation ended. Started missing the natural flow of conversation we'd had before. I'd complained about him dominating discussion time, posted about how husband was asking questions, but conversations felt forced and unnatural now, without real engagement. Some women said he was maliciously complying by making conversations awkward to punish me for asking him to change. Others said men often don't know how to have real conversations without making everything about themselves first. Third week. Michael seemed even more withdrawn. Would come home and eat dinner, mostly in silence, unless I started conversation. When I'd ask about his day, he'd give minimal answers, like fine or same as usual. Rather than sharing stories like before, I'd ask follow-up questions trying to draw out details. But he'd give short responses, seeming reluctant to elaborate. Then he'd ask his standard questions about my day in same mechanical way that felt increasingly hollow and disconnected. Confronted him about why he'd stopped sharing about his work and day. Said I'd wanted balance. Not for him to stop talking entirely. He said I told him he was dominating conversations by talking too much. So he was trying to talk less, like I'd asked. I said I wanted him to talk less while also being more engaged with me. Not just become silent and withdrawn. He said quietly that he didn't know how to do both. Talk less and stay engaged. That talking about his day was how he connected. That when I'd said he dominated conversations, it made him self-conscious about sharing anything because it might be too much. So he decided safer approach was to minimize his own talking and focus on asking me questions like I'd requested. But then asking questions felt performative because he was doing it because I'd told him to, not because it was natural. Now he felt like he couldn't talk about his day without dominating and couldn't ask about mine without it feeling fake. So he'd started just staying quiet because trying to navigate my requirements felt impossible and exhausting to manage. I felt terrible hearing this. Said, I hadn't meant to make him feel like he couldn't share about his day at all. He said, maybe you didn't mean it that way. But that's how it landed. When you criticized me for dominating conversations, made me afraid that anything I shared was taking up too much space or centering myself when you needed to be centered. Asked what would help him feel comfortable sharing again while still maintaining better conversational balance between us. He said honestly, he didn't know. Had become so self-conscious about talking too much that sharing anything felt wrong. Now that he missed talking about his day and hearing about mine in a natural way without tracking time or measuring balance, but couldn't figure out how to get back to that after being told the natural way was actually me dominating conversations. Fourth week conversations had deteriorated to nearly complete silence during dinners and evenings together at home. Michael would come home, eat dinner quietly, ask basic, how was your day question, listen to answer, then retreat to different room. I try to start conversations about various topics, but his responses were minimal, showing he'd emotionally checked out. Started feeling lonely in marriage, where we'd gone from him talking too much to barely communicating at all. Posted on forums about husband who'd shut down completely after I'd asked for more conversational balance and equity. Got mixed responses. Some saying he was punishing me with silence. Others saying I'd made him feel his natural communication was wrong. One woman commented, "You asked him to talk less?" And he did. Seems like malicious compliance punishing you for having needs. Another commented, "You criticize the way he naturally connects, and now he doesn't feel safe being himself in conversations." These conflicting interpretations made me question whether Michael was punishing me or genuinely struggling with what I'd asked. Talked to therapist about conversational dynamics and how my feedback had led to Michael withdrawing almost completely. She asked me to describe what I'd hoped to achieve by asking Michael to dominate conversations less frequently. I explained I'd wanted more equal space in conversations rather than him filling most of time with his own stories. She asked if equal space had to mean equal talking time, or if there were other ways to have balanced conversation. I said I'd tracked that he talked 60 to 70% of time, while I talked 30 to 40%, which seemed objectively unbalanced and unfair. She asked if percentage of talking time was accurate, measure of conversational balance, or if other factors mattered too, like who was more naturally talkative, who had more eventful days, who enjoyed storytelling versus who preferred listening. This made me uncomfortable because it suggested maybe equal percentages wasn't right way to measure balanced conversation. She said, "It sounds like Michael was naturally more talkative person who enjoyed sharing stories from his eventful workdays, while you might be more naturally reserved or had quieter work that generated fewer stories to share during dinners. That expecting exact equal talking time might have been imposing artificial standard on natural communication patterns." I said, "But women are socialized to listen, while men are socialized to dominate. Wasn't fair to accept that pattern." She said, "Difference between socialization causing imbalance and natural differences in talkativeness and story generation, that if Michael was more talkative and had more dramatic work days, he might naturally talk more without it being domination." Asked if I'd felt silenced or unheard in conversations before complaining, or just noticed he talked more quantitatively. I was quiet because honestly, I'd felt heard and interested in his stories. Had mainly noticed imbalance after tracking time. She said, "So you'd been satisfied with conversations until you started measuring equality by percentage of talking time. Then you'd criticized Michael for pattern that had previously felt natural and comfortable to both of you. Now he felt self-conscious and unable to communicate naturally. Conversations had deteriorated from natural to silent. This realization was painful, that I created problem by measuring something that hadn't actually been bothering me before. I started thinking back over 6 years of marriage and whether I'd actually felt silenced before I started tracking conversation time. Realized Michael's storytelling had always felt engaging and interesting. I'd enjoyed hearing about his construction projects, had felt heard and valued when I did share, because he'd been genuinely interested even if I shared less frequently. Problem hadn't been feeling unheard. Problem had been noticing percentage imbalance and deciding that meant domination. Called Michael, hoping to talk about what therapist had helped me understand about natural versus imposed conversation balance. He said he was willing to talk, but he'd become so withdrawn, he wasn't sure he could get back to comfortable communication. I said I realized I'd created problem by measuring talking time when conversations had actually been fine before measuring that I'd imposed a quality standard based on percentages without considering we might naturally have different communication styles. He was quiet, then said yes. "That's exactly what happened. You measured something that was working and decided it was problem. I'd always thought you enjoyed hearing about my projects and days. Asked if you wanted to share more when you seemed quiet. You'd always said you didn't have much to share or were content listening. Seemed like natural balance that worked for us. Then suddenly you're tracking time and telling me I'm dominating conversations when I thought we were both happy with dynamic made me feel like the way I naturally communicate was wrong and oppressive, rather than just being who I am as perso. I apologize for imposing artificial standard and making him feel like his natural communication style was problematic." He said, "I appreciate apology, but damage is done. I can't unknow that you see my talkativeness as domination, not personality. Every time I want to share story now, I wonder if I'm talking too much or taking up too much space in conversation. It's exhausting, constantly monitoring myself. And I've learned it's easier to just not talk than to worry about dominating." Asked desperately what I could do to help him feel comfortable being himself in conversations again after months of silence. He said honestly he didn't know if he could get back to natural communication after being told natural way was problematic. That he'd need time and probably couldn't just flip switch back to sharing freely after months of feeling self-conscious. This conversation made clear that damage from my criticism might be permanent even if I'd realized it was misguided. 2 months of near-silent dinners and minimal communication between us, Michael remained emotionally withdrawn and distant. Would fulfill basic spouse duties, but had stopped the natural storytelling and engagement that had characterized our marriage. Started couples therapy, hoping therapists could help us rebuild communication after I destroyed natural dynamic with criticism. Therapist asked Michael to describe how he experienced conversation dynamics before and after my feedback about domination. He explained that he'd always been naturally talkative and energetic about sharing workday experiences and stories. that I'd seemed to enjoy hearing about projects and would ask follow-up questions showing genuine interest and engagement. When he'd asked about my day, I'd usually say it was fine or share briefly. Seemed content with shorter updates. Had thought that was natural pattern based on our different personalities and types of work we did daily. Then I told him he was dominating conversations and needed to talk less. Made him feel his communication was oppressive. He tried to modify by talking less and asking more, but it felt forced. Eventually stopped talking much at all. Now he felt disconnected and unable to be himself in marriage, where his natural communication had been labeled problematic. Therapist asked me why I decided conversation pattern that had seemed fine was actually problem needing intervention. I explained I'd read feminist literature about conversational domination and started noticing Michael talked more than I did. That tracking confirmed he used 60 to 70% of conversation time, which seemed objectively unfair and imbalanced. She asked if I'd felt unheard or silenced before measuring percentages or just noticed imbalance after starting to track. I admitted I'd felt heard and enjoyed conversations before measuring, had tracked because ideology said imbalance meant domination. She said, "It sounds like you imposed ideological framework onto relationship dynamic that was actually working for both of you. That natural differences in talkativeness and story generation created pattern you both found comfortable and engaging, but feminist framework about equal talk time made you see natural pattern as problematic domination requiring correction. Now Michael feels unsafe being himself and you've lost natural communication you both previously enjoyed. This session made painfully clear that I destroyed something good by applying ideological standard to relationship that didn't need it. 3 months after initial conversation about domination, Michael and I were still struggling to rebuild natural communication. He was trying to share more again. But it felt tentative and self-conscious rather than energetic and natural like before. Would start story, then stop himself asking if I wanted to hear it or if he was talking too much already. I'd encourage him to continue, but damage had been done to his confidence about sharing freely without being problematic. Therapist worked with us on rebuilding trust that his natural communication style was acceptable and valued in marriage. But Michael struggled to believe, after months of being told his talkativeness was domination that needed correction. 6 months after initial feedback about conversation domination, we remained stuck in stilted, uncomfortable communication pattern. Michael had never fully recovered his natural ease with sharing stories and being energetically engaged in conversation. Would share basic updates, but had lost enthusiasm and detail that had made his storytelling engaging and enjoyable. I'd lost the engaging conversations about his construction work that I'd actually enjoyed before deciding they were domination. Our marriage felt hollow without the natural communication dynamic that had been core of our connection for 6 years. Posted article about what happened titled, "I told my husband he dominated conversations and now he won't talk to me." Detailed how I'd tracked talk time. Decided 60/40 split was domination. Gave feedback. Watched him withdraw completely. Explained that conversations had actually been fine before I'd measured them against ideological standard about equal time, and that my criticism had destroyed natural communication pattern that had worked for both of us for 6 years. Article went viral with over 300K shares, as many people related to destroying good dynamics through ideological critique. Many women appreciated honest accounting of how feminist framework had made problem out of satisfying relationship dynamic. One commenter said, "I did similar thing to my partner tracking talk time when conversations were actually fine before measuring." Another said, "Reading this helped me realize I'm about to make same mistake, criticizing partner's natural talkativeness." Men's responses validated experience of being told natural communication style was problematic, then struggling to recover. One man commented, "My girlfriend criticized me for talking too much. Now I'm silent and she's upset. Can't win either way." Another commented, "Being told you dominate conversations makes you self-conscious about every word. Easier to just stay quiet." But some feminists criticized articles saying, "I'd given up on equality because achieving it required uncomfortable adjustment. One blogger wrote, "Author backed down on legitimate demand for conversational equity because husband couldn't handle change." Another wrote, "Men withdrawing when asked to talk less is manipulation." Article validates that manipulation as women's problem. These criticisms felt hollow after experiencing how ideology had destroyed actual satisfying communication in my marriage. Year after conversation about domination, Michael and I separated, couldn't recover natural dynamic that had defined our connection. He moved out, saying he felt like he could never be himself around me after being told his natural self was oppressive. That he needed to be with someone who appreciated his talkativeness rather than measured it against equality standards. I felt devastated that my ideological critique had destroyed 6-year marriage over communication pattern that had been working. Posted about separation, explaining how my demand for conversational equity had led to complete communication breakdown and divorce. Got responses from people who'd experienced similar patterns of ideological standards, destroying satisfying relationship dynamics. One woman said she'd divorced husband over emotional labor concerns that were actually fine until she started measuring them. Another said she'd criticized partner's natural behavior based on feminist frameworks until he left for someone who accepted him. 2 years after initial conversation about domination, Michael and I finalized divorce. He'd started dating someone new. Heard through mutual friends, his girlfriend was also naturally quiet and enjoyed listening to his stories about work. That he'd found someone who appreciated his communication style rather than seeing it through lens of domination and oppression. This news made me realize he needed partner who valued him as he was rather than partner. Trying to modify him for ideology. Started therapy intensive to understand why I destroyed satisfying marriage by imposing ideological standards on working dynamics. Therapist helped me see I'd confused feminist critique of patriarchal communication with critique of individual personality differences. That Michael talking more wasn't him dominating his man, but natural result of being more talkative, with more eventful work, and that I'd had space to share when I wanted, but often didn't have much to share or enjoyed. Listening more than talking. This pattern had been satisfying to both of us until I decided satisfaction didn't matter if percentages weren't equal. 3 years after conversation, started writing about what I'd learned from destroying marriage through conversational critique. Posted articles about difference between actual domination that silences versus natural personality differences in talkativeness. Got responses from women reconsidering whether their partners were actually dominating or just naturally more talkative people. One woman said, "Reading your articles helped me stop tracking talk time and start appreciating partners' energetic sharing." Another said, "I was about to criticize boyfriend for talking more, but realized I actually enjoy listening to his stories. Started doing relationship coaching, helping women distinguish between feeling silenced versus having naturally quieter personality. One client was planning to confront husband about dominating conversations when actually she enjoyed his storytelling. Helped her see that equal percentages wasn't necessary for satisfying communication if both people felt heard and valued. She stopped measuring, and their conversations remained naturally engaging, without artificial equality standard imposed. Another client had already criticized partner for talking too much, and he'd withdrawn completely, like Michael had with me. Worked with them on rebuilding trust that his natural talkativeness was valued. Not problematic domination needing correction. 4 years after conversation, published book titled When Feminist Critique Destroys Satisfying Relationships. Detailed complete story, from tracking talk time to criticizing Michael to him. Withdrawing to separation and divorce. Included research about how personality differences and talkativeness got misinterpreted as gender domination patterns and framework for distinguishing actual silencing from natural communication patterns that worked for both partners. Book resonated with people who'd struggled with imposing ideological standards on relationship dynamics that were actually working. One reviewer wrote, "Essential reading about danger of measuring relationships against ideology rather than actual satisfaction." Another wrote, "Author's painful honesty about destroying marriage through critique helps readers avoid same mistake." 5 years after ordering husband to stop dominating conversations, reflected on how completely that had destroyed our marriage. Realized my biggest mistake had been prioritizing ideological equality over actual relationship satisfaction and dynamics. That Michael and I had both been satisfied with natural communication until I'd measured it against feminist standard, and that his withdrawal after criticism had been genuine struggle, not manipulation. He'd really felt unsafe being himself. Current reflections, 6 years after telling husband to stop dominating and watching him stop talking entirely. Learned that ideological frameworks about conversational equity don't account for natural personality differences and preferences, that tracking talk time percentages can create problems in relationships where communication was actually working well, that criticizing partners' natural talkativeness as domination makes them self-conscious and unable to communicate freely, that equal talk time isn't necessary for satisfying conversation if both partners feel heard and valued and dynamic. Most importantly, that Michael's withdrawal wasn't manipulation, but genuine loss of safety after being told natural self was oppressive. That's what I learned from ordering husband to stop dominating and panicking when he stopped talking at all. From tracking percentages to realizing satisfaction matters more than equal distribution of conversation time. From seeing talkativeness as domination to understanding it was personality trait I'd actually enjoyed before measuring. That's my complete story about destroying marriage by imposing conversational equity on dynamic that was actually working. 6 years after ordering change, continued teaching workshops about distinguishing real domination from personality differences. Most impactful sessions involved people recognizing they were about to criticize satisfying dynamics using ideological frameworks. One participant was tracking partner's talk time planning intervention when workshop helped her see she actually enjoyed dynamic. Another participant had already criticized partner, like I'd done with Michael, worked on rebuilding after unnecessary damage. 7 years after conversation reflected on complete transformation from ideological critic to advocate for relationship satisfaction, realized that Michael talking more had been natural result of personality and work, not domination, requiring correction that I destroyed satisfying communication by measuring it against standard that didn't account for our actual preferences, and that his stopping asking about my day was logical outcome of being told his natural communication was problematic. Current reflection. 8 years after ordering husband to stop dominating conversations and losing everything I'd valued, learned that sometimes satisfying relationship dynamics don't match ideological ideals, but destroying them creates worse outcomes. That Michael's natural talkativeness had been engaging part of our marriage I'd actually enjoyed before measuring percentages, that equal talk time matters less than both partners feeling heard, valued and satisfied with communication dynamic. Most importantly, that ordering change based on ideology rather than actual dissatisfaction destroyed marriage that was working. That's everything learned from 8 years of reflection on ordering conversational change and watching husband withdraw completely. From tracking percentages to understanding satisfaction matters more than equal distribution measured by clock. From seeing talkativeness as domination to recognizing it was personality creating dynamic we both enjoyed. That's my final lesson about destroying satisfying marriage by imposing ideological conversational equity on working relationship. 8 years after ordering conversational change, continued relationship coaching, helping women evaluate dynamics before criticizing them. Most powerful sessions involved women who'd been tracking talk time planning interventions on satisfying communication patterns. One client had spreadsheet documenting every conversation with boyfriend, showing he talked 65% of time on average. After hearing my story, she realized she actually enjoyed his storytelling and wasn't feeling silenced despite percentage imbalance. Deleted spreadsheet and stopped tracking. Their relationship improved when she stopped measuring and started appreciating again. Another client had already given feedback like mine to Michael. Husband had withdrawn, becoming silent and distant. Worked with them on rebuilding trust that his natural communication style was valued, not problematic behavior needing correction. He slowly started sharing again when he felt safe that talkativeness wouldn't be criticized as domination anymore. 9 years after conversation, published follow-up research on satisfaction versus equality in relationship communication patterns, studied 400 couples, comparing talk time distribution with reported satisfaction about feeling heard and valued in relationships, found that satisfaction had weak correlation with equal percentages but strong correlation with both partners feeling heard. Couples where one partner talked 70% but both felt satisfied had better outcomes than couples forcing 50/50 splits. Research validated what I'd learned, destroying my marriage. That equality in percentages didn't predict relationship satisfaction. Started training couples therapists on helping clients distinguish between dissatisfaction, requiring change in ideology, creating problems. Main framework was assessing actual feelings of being heard versus measuring against ideological standards about equal time. First, therapists implementing training reported better outcomes with couples who'd been stuck in communication conflicts. One therapist said she'd been helping couple force equal talk time when framework helped her see both were satisfied with natural pattern. They stopped trying to equalize percentages and satisfaction increased when pressure to meet arbitrary standard was removed. 10 years after ordering Michael to stop dominating, reflected on decade of learning from destroying marriage through critique, realized that single conversation about conversational domination had started cascade ending in divorce and years of regret. That Michael's natural talkativeness had been feature of our marriage I'd enjoyed until ideology told me to measure it, and that his withdrawal after criticism had been predictable outcome of making someone feel their natural self was oppressive. Started speaking at communication conferences about my experience destroying satisfying dynamic through ideological measurement. Main message was that I'd been satisfied with conversations until I started tracking percentages based on feminist frameworks, that Michael hadn't been dominating in sense of silencing me. He'd been naturally talkative with eventful work, creating stories, and that ordering him to change based on ideology rather than actual dissatisfaction had destroyed marriage that worked. One conference attendee said she'd been planning to track partners' talk time. Presentation stopped her from creating unnecessary problem. Another said she'd already criticized partner like I had. Learning from my experience helped her repair damage before losing relationship. Current reflection, 11 years after ordering husband to stop dominating and watching him stop engaging entirely. Learned that conversational equity measured by percentages doesn't account for personality differences and natural communication styles. That being satisfied with dynamic matters more than whether percentages match ideological standards about equal distribution. That criticizing natural talkativeness as domination creates self-consciousness, destroying ability to communicate freely and naturally. Most importantly, that Michael's decision to stop asking about my day was direct result of me making his natural communication feel wrong. That's everything from 11 years of reflection on ordering conversational change based on ideology, destroying satisfying marriage, from tracking percentages obsessively to understanding actual satisfaction matters more than measured equality in relationships. From criticizing talkativeness as domination to recognizing it was personality trait creating dynamic we both genuinely enjoyed. That's my complete final lesson about destroying marriage by measuring working communication against ideological standard rather than our actual experience.